Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President of Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT. And welcome to WTTW's Community Screening and Community Conversation of Indie Lens pop-up film, Apart. We are proud to partner with Illinois Humanities on today's event. I can think of no better partner for today than the Illinois Humanities. Their mission is to strengthen the social, political, and economic fabric of Illinois through constructive conversation and community engagement. I would like to thank Illinois Humanities Executive Director, Gabrielle Lyon, and her entire team for their partnership on today's event. Apart premieres on all WTTW platforms on Monday, February 21st at 10 p.m. Central. WTTW's purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. The purpose of our community screening and conversation is to spark enlightening conversations that shed light on the critical issues impacting our community, nation, and the world. After the screening, Sylvia Ewing, who can be seen on WTTW and around the country as an on-air television host for PBS fundraising specials, will moderate the online conversation, featuring Reuben Jonathan Miller, Associate Professor, Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago, Meredith Nnoka, Illinois Humanities Envisioning Justice Fellow, Janine Ott, Associate Director, Workforce Development at Elevate Energy, and Colette Payne, Director of the Women's Justice Institute Reclamation Project. Please note, the conversation was pre-recorded. However, you will be able to live chat with the moderator and panelists throughout today's event. Finally, thank you to our members, national partners, Independent Lens, ITVS, PBS, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Acton Family Giving, Ford Foundation, John and D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Winecoat Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts for your support of today's documentary. Now, I hope you enjoy today's show.
Hello and welcome to this community conversation. We're so glad that you're here, and we're going to dive right into the important topic that was raised by the documentary that we've just enjoyed. I'm Sylvia Ewing, and I'm joined by a very distinguished panel: Reuben Jonathan Miller, Associate Professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago; Meredith Nnoka, Illinois Humanities Envisioning Justice Fellow; Colette Payne, Director of the Women's Justice Institute Reclamation Project; and Janine Ott, Associate Director of Workforce Development with Elevate. And by way of full disclosure, Janine is a colleague of mine. And, so is everybody at WTTW and half of Chicago. But I'm really glad that you're here. If you think about the question of who is incarcerated, what comes to mind? What's the image that you have in your head? Very often, the stereotypes that we think of are vastly different than reality and then what we see in television and in popular culture. And the number of women in prison has increased by over 800% since the war on drugs. Women are the fastest growing population in the prison system. Why and what does this mean? I'm going to come to you first, Meredith. What's your take on that question? Why is this the fastest growing population, and what does it say about us?
Thank you, Sylvia. So in Illinois alone, since 1980, the number of women in prison has actually increased by 1,015%. That's just Illinois. The women who are being locked up are the ones who needed help and didn't receive it. Almost 3 million women a year are jailed in the US across the country. Nearly half of all women who are incarcerated in the US are actually in local jails. The thing about jails is that people are usually there for lower level offenses, often because they can't pay bail and often because they're awaiting trial. Over half of women incarcerated in jail specifically are awaiting trial, meaning that they haven't been convicted of anything, and meaning most likely that they can't afford to leave. There's really no clear data on how many of those women are there because they can't afford their money bond. But what we do know, excuse me, there's a siren in the background. What we do know is that the average annual income for a woman in prison who can afford to leave is $11,000 a year, which means that we're incarcerating the most vulnerable members of our society instead of helping them. At least 2/3 of incarcerated women have experienced abuse, mental illness, addiction, meaning that these are the most precariously positioned groups in our entire country. Women, and primarily poor women and/or women of color, are being locked up at unprecedented rates. And at the same time, we're also cutting back on the kinds of resources that keep people from going to prison, such as housing support and drug treatment.
And we're going to get into even more because the passion, the wealth of information, I promised we had experts. You have given us enough to talk about for about an hour, but let's say that we now have a good overview of some of the reasons, some of the causes, and some of the situations that are facing women. Janine, would you add to that from your professional experience or any other perspective?
Thanks, Sylvia. Yes, to build on that, I completely agree that a lot of what we're seeing in reality and what was portrayed on film is the existing systems are not meeting the needs of women, and in terms of whether that be childcare, whether that be healthcare, addiction support, having those supports in their own communities to avoid incarceration in the first place is something that to me was very apparent in this film. And more than anything, I think what really stood out to me in the film is sort of just the heartbreaking experience that we see on film of the mothers and children and their families, and how this is really impacting communities.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to raise something that was not mentioned in the film, which I would like to hear your perspective on, and that is the fact that we are in a pandemic. We are facing COVID. It is impossible, I would imagine, to isolate appropriately or to practice some of the best health examples when you are incarcerated. Social distancing seems to be next to impossible. And groups like the Color of Change, in partnership with the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, are calling on the Bureau of Prisons to release medically vulnerable people from prisons, from federal prisons immediately. And Colette, I'll come to you with your organization and with your experience at the Women's Justice Institute Reclamation Project. What's your take on what should be done about COVID and people who are incarcerated?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So as a formerly incarcerated woman, I know firsthand that social distancing is not possible. You're in a small cell, sometimes 2 beds, 4 beds, 1 bathroom. It's absolutely hard to distance from one another. And then you have to look at it as a health crisis. COVID is a health crisis. It's being considered as a health crisis, which it is. People are dying. You have Uptown People's Law with organizations in coalition working on these issues. When I looked at their website, you have over 30,000 people who are incarcerated in the 25 Illinois prisons. And you look at the numbers and how they rise as it relates to the people who are housed in a correctional facility, the staff. What does it look like? Who's bringing it in? So it is a mandate that people should be vaccinated. Of course, people who are housed there have had the vaccination. That's if they want to, but everybody doesn't want to. So when you look at it, like people who don't want to comply with this mandate, they're either being forced to leave their jobs or they're just bringing it in. Now, what I've seen is by going into the prisons, folks who aren't mandated, that means correctional officers, they get tested daily, swabbed to see if they have COVID. I don't know how that's working, but as of this year, I'm not sure if anybody has died, but we have had people who are housed in a correctional facility pass away.
And Professor Miller, what's your perspective? And if I may, I'll call you Reuben.
Of course. These are things that we should have known. These are things that we could have guessed. These are things that, in fact, we did know. We were warned both by people who've been locked away in the cages that we put them in throughout American jails and prisons, and also by public health professionals across the country who have been calling for 2 years for a national response to COVID-19 inside jails and prisons. We knew that COVID-19 would be a hot spot. That jails and prisons will be a hotspot for COVID-19 because jails and prisons are a hotspot for every form of chronic illness and communicable disease. We know that HIV risk is 5 to 9 times greater. Tuberculosis, a disease that has been eradicated in the rest of the country, is alive and well and has been inside jails and prisons, 5 to 9 times greater likelihood of risk. There's a public health researcher, Eric Reinhardt, who works at Northwestern University, who's an anthropologist and a psychiatrist who also does epidemiological research, who finds that COVID spread in prisons was directly linked to a high percentage of COVID spread in communities from which prisoners were concentrated. And so these are things that we've known literally forever, but because we don't care about who we lock away, even if they're women, and this goes to your point about the stereotypes that we've imagined. When we think about prisoners, we think about men, we think about poor Black men who are in gangs or et cetera. But we're locking away women at this alarming rate because we don't care about them or their families. And so we don't care to respond in ways that we need to, despite our warnings, for things like COVID risk.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, it wasn't touched on at the time that the documentary was made. It was filmed over a period of 3 years and really gives us such detailed information. But I wanted to center us in this moment and talk about that. So I do want to go back to how the documentary resonated for each of you. We had 3 Midwestern women. They came from spaces outside of Cook County and our viewing region, where fines and fees were still getting people incarcerated. I know there's been a lot of work done in Cook County to reduce that. But what resonated the most with you? Janine, you touched on it a little bit, but is there anything that you want to add on what resonated the most with you from this documentary apart?
Sure, thanks, Sylvia. So at Elevate, what I do at Elevate is I work with communities like we've often seen in this documentary. So at Elevate, our goal is to make sure that everyone has access to clean water, power, and heat in their homes and communities. And part of that is also ensuring that people have access to those resources, training, and jobs to be able to do that. And so that puts me in a situation where I have the opportunity to engage with women who've been in experiences like we saw in the documentary. And what stood out to me as we've sought to support women, such as the women in the documentary, in accessing jobs and accessing in the clean energy economy, is just how common some of the experiences are that I saw in the film. For example, just upon as the women were pondering release, they were thinking about how difficult it was to think past the immediate and past kind of just getting out and seeing their families and just getting a job and making ends meet. And a lot of what we do is try to help folks see that there are other things out there, such as solar energy and energy efficiency and some of these emerging technologies that they do have access to, but not without difficulty, because the systems within that we're operating in are still challenging as it relates to our system. So when we saw women encountering difficulty of just getting calls back because of their records, or low wages, I saw a woman applying for jobs at $10 an hour. Things like that do not lift people out of poverty. And of course, what we saw is they just add to the burdens that people are already experiencing, whether those be fines, fees, just their own precious time and emotional capital. So those are some of the things that stood out to me as what I've seen quite a bit within our work. and as well as some of those challenges that brought people to the situation in the first place, in terms of not having supports, support for addiction, support for their families, or being in an environment where they saw stable income.
And I want to get this response from all of you, but the one mom who had used medicine for her legitimate pain, when she admitted that she was feared that she was addicted, she got kicked off. Meredith, what's your response, and how common is that kind of reaction?
So this is actually incredibly common. These stories happen in every community in every state in the country. A similar story happened to my family, where my mother now has a felony record because she had untreated mental illness that was left for her to deal with, and she ended up in a dark place. And the question that kept coming back through my mind when I was watching this is, who's better off? Right? Who's healthier or safer or happier because, Tamika or Amanda or Lydia went to prison and were forcibly removed from their children, right? The result of that is that at the end of all of those years of incarceration, those children were left basically alone to deal with this incredible pain without their moms. I've dealt with it almost. My mother was not incarcerated, but she very nearly was. And not everyone is as fortunate as my family, right? Some people really do have to go through that every day. So yeah, it's extremely common. And actually the Equal Justice Initiative recently estimated that 1 out of every 2 Americans knows someone or is connected to someone who's been incarcerated in their lifetime. So yeah, it's half of us, right? Everyone has to deal with this on some level.
I love your question, who benefits? If you're just tuning in, you're watching a WTTW community conversation about the documentary Apart. And Reuben, I'll come to you. What resonated with you about the film?
The deep need. I mean, when I see people's relationships with their children broken, I'm always crushed. So the deep need for connection, and the deep need of the services that were there that far too many people have access to. Not enough people have access to the kinds of family reunification services that we saw that the women were getting on the inside. And this is because the welfare state was retrenching at the same time as we saw a ramp up of the criminal justice system. So this moment of the war on drugs that we often mark, this kind of 1980s moment, is accompanied by a retreat of the government from providing essential social services and the kind of care and support that people need. So it's unsurprising, again, that once you get inside of a prison, you see very limited access to the things that people needed. So families are broken. Families have a hard time reunifying because they don't have the supports that they need to do it. And they don't have the supports that they need to do it because we refuse to provide for them. There was a study that showed, and I'll end with this, there was a study that showed that there's only about 1/4 of the capacity to treat the people who are mandated to receive drug treatment inside prison. So in other words, for everybody a judge says you must do drug treatment while you're in order to get out, we only have the capacity to treat 1 in 4 people. This is the world that we've made. This is the world we have to unmake.
Well, I really appreciate that. And Colette, I'd like to hear both your reaction, but also I noticed that we had these women did have access to services and restorative meetings and programs that, if they had been available, could have prevented them from becoming incarcerated in the first place. So I'd love to hear your experience, both of what you thought of the film, how accurate it was, and about the lack of programs to keep these problems from occurring.
Absolutely. So you looking at the number of women who are incarcerated across the country, and in that particular prison, how many women had access to that program? Only 30 women. What about the rest of the women? What about the rest of the women who need that support? And this program was outside of the prison wall, so they had to go outside of the gate. I looked at each woman was wearing an ankle monitor while they were in the prison. So they were in a prison within a prison. So why do you have to wear an ankle monitor while you're in prison? And why should people have to go to jail or prison to get the services they need when they should be readily available in one of the richest countries in the United States? We have money, one of the richest countries. I think about the drivers that drive women to prison, and it's criminalization for drug use instead of treatment. So for small level drug offenses, and this is in our report, the Women's Justice Institute, we recently released a report last year that has over 250 recommendations on how to cut the prison population in half and improve the health and well-being of children and families. We look at health and well-being, safe and stable housing, economic security and empowerment, supported families, and relationship safeties. Those are a must for women. You look at, I believe it was Amanda who said she was born into this. Folks in her family used drugs. This is what she saw. This is what she lived. So, they had an opportunity to tell those stories. Looking at the beginning, we don't get a chance to tell those stories, starting from the point of arrest. So it's a cycle. And arrest starts within the community.
Our state's attorney has said by the time she gets them, it's something has already been broken, in society. I want to come to Meredith again for a question, and others may want to weigh in on this. Thank you so much, Colette. But the phone calls home were a lifeline, heartbreaking, mom pretending to be at college as long as she could, all of those things. But they're also very often, at least it's my understanding, and I'm not an expert, but they're run by private for-profit companies. And, what does this do to a family and to families' expenses? Meredith, can you address any of that?
Sure. So how much a phone call costs actually varies from state to state, and which companies they use.
And I hope I didn't freeze for a minute. I may have.
You definitely did. So in Illinois, we use a for-profit company that's called Securus, which charges people incarcerated about just under a penny a minute for a 20-minute phone call, so just under 20 cents per phone call. And that's actually a really recent development. That's just since 2018, because the campaign for prison phone justice worked so hard. And in Illinois, we're really fortunate that we have so many people who work on that campaign or have worked on that campaign. But that's not true in all states, right? We're very lucky here that we have that option, that people fought so hard to reduce those rates. We know, as you said, that phone calls are a lifeline, that they're an absolute necessity. They're one of the only sources of comfort for many people in prison. So charging inordinately expensive rates for people who already have trouble paying for basic fees and basic services that they charge you in prison, charging those people who are the least able to pay those fees is cruelty in action. That's a service that people desperately want and desperately need, and charging them when they can't afford to pay is further isolating them from their families. I think in an ideal world, it would be a free and abundantly available service, but in Illinois, at least, it's a start, right? That's what we have, and it's better than other places.
Well, thank you for that. And I may have had a technical difficulty, so my apologies. But we pick up the story at a point when our folks are preparing to go home, and I'm just curious what would the story be if it was at a time when Tamika and Lydia and Amanda were earlier in their incarceration? Like, how important, dangerous, or sensitive is that moment when freedom is something you can almost taste or smell, but you might not get it, as we saw with Amanda with her first hearing. Reuben, can you speak to that in any way? And then I'll come to you as well, Colette.
No, I mean, of course, the research on prisoner reentry tells us that the more what criminologists might call touches or more contacts that service providers have with their clients at earlier and earlier points really does matter for their outcomes later. So the more contact they have, the duration of the contact, and then as early in the process as possible, really does matter. This is why that program, I think, is a real demonstration of kind of the power of services on the inside, long-term relationships. These things really do matter. But I should say that it is exceptionally important to make sure that you make contact with people about 6 months before they're released so they have a place to land. And so the most successful reentry organizations are reaching in early and maintaining contact at these critical moments. So when you first get there, when you're on your way out the door, and then over time for at least a year upon release, because that first year out, we know from the criminological literature, is the year in which people are most likely to be rearrested.
Well, thank you for that. And Colette, I want to offer my deep appreciation for your being an advocate and being willing to share your story. What does the timing, how does the timing of the support that you get tie in? And what was your experience, or those of women who you're willing to talk about?
Absolutely. I think time differs depending on how much time you have. So for example, I've been to prison 4 times. I did my first prison sentence at the age of 14. Now, when I got to the adult system, if you're given 2 years, you only get 6 months. So what do services look like for a person who has that short window period to try to put their life back together? It doesn't always happen. I recidivated time and time after, again, in and out the county jail because I didn't have the supports. And they're not provided. It was only during my last stay, which I did. I got 5 years. After 5 years, you do a 3-year sentence. And I had an opportunity to participate in certain programs that helped me regain my identity of who I was instead of what they said I was. So it looks different for people. I've been inside and done focus groups, and I had a woman I spoke with a woman who had did 20 years. So she's like, I don't know what I'm gonna do.
You might be on mute.
Family has passed away. I don't even know where I'm going to go. You've done over 20 years. You don't know where you're gonna go. You don't know how to work technology because they had beepers or whatever it was when you went in. And it just makes it unbearable. And a person has a lot of anxiety when they have to think about those things. So when a person doesn't have anywhere to go, they're most likely to go to a shelter. And it isn't always a shelter of their choice. And some of these shelters, okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's so much that we can learn. And I want to remind people that this full documentary will air on WTTW on all of the platforms on February 21st at 10 p.m. Kind of adult content, good time to listen, tell a friend. I hope that the perspective that this panel has shared makes the understanding richer and really centers the story in our region. But we do have a few more minutes. Sorry to cut you off, Colette, but I'd like to go around and just have your final thoughts about the biggest takeaway from this film And also, how can we who care, because we're tuning in, we're listening, how can we be a part of the justice reform that's needed? And I'll come with to you, Janine, first.
Thanks, Sylvia. I think some things I'd like to share with folks, or things to keep in mind, are that above everything else, people need systems of support and care, and we need systems that value women and people overall. We need these things. It is not enough to say, we'll give you some training, you're going to be okay. No, people need wraparound supports on a long-term level, and that is people in general, and especially people who've been incarcerated and women. And in terms of what people can do, I would say in any individual situation, if you're in a position to influence greater investment or support for childcare, healthcare, therapy, all these different support systems, please advocate for those things. And also speak out against the systems that are oppressing people, such as the mandatory minimums, which we saw in the film, and these other unjust laws that impact people. And
thank you, Janine. And I also like your centering that what can society do, because alone it's hard. Meredith, I'll come to you, and thank you also for being candid and sharing your story, your personal story. I know as a Envisioning Justice Fellow for Illinois Humanities, you're bringing it into your life in many ways. But what are your final thoughts about what we can do for a more just system?
Thanks, Sylvia. So sort of my biggest takeaway from this documentary was that, you know, if we think about the fact that half of all Americans go through this at some stage in their life, this is damage that we're doing to half of the country. And more often than not, in one way or another, women are bearing the brunt of that damage, whether it's because they're the ones left behind or because they're the ones taken away. One way I would say you could help, so someone I interviewed for a video series that we made through the Envisioning Justice Initiative, her name is Beth Ritchie, and she teaches at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's amazing. She talked to me about how there's really always something that you can be doing. There's a petition that you can sign. There's a book that you can read and talk to other people about. But there's always something that we can be doing. You know, right now in Illinois and Chicago, it's winter, and there are people who are coming out of jail and prison who may not have winter gear waiting for them when they get out. Maybe there's a clothing drive you can donate to. You know, there's always something. So I would say, don't be afraid to go looking for ways you can contribute, because there's definitely something you can do and that will suit your interests.
Well, thank you. And that's a very concrete example and a great resource with Professor Ritchie. Colette, I'll come to you as well. What can we do?
So I think it's important that we as a community, and that's going to take all system stakeholders, communities, it's going to take interagency communication. And we should be gender responsive, trauma informed. And at the point of contact, when a woman comes in contact with the judicial system, ask about the history. Like, they don't take into account the traumas that we have experienced. You have to look at least 70% of women are impacted by sexual violence, domestic abuse, related traumas, mental illness, and poverty. It is the biggest one of all. That is not taken into account what it was that led us to where we are at, and that is in jails or in prison. So it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love your saying gender responsive and trauma informed. Thank you, Colette. And Reuben, you get the last word here.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful panel. I've learned so much hanging out with my colleagues and you, Sylvia. I would like to also remind us that when you incarcerate anyone, but especially when you incarcerate women, you're incarcerating a family. The families do time with the loved one in an American jail or prison. And this is something that prosecutors need to think about. This is something judges need to think about. This is something that employers and landlords, folks who are over whether or not someone gets a license to take care of themselves and their loved ones need to think about when they're making decisions, that we're not just locking away individuals. Punishment goes so far beyond the person who's in the cage. And what we need to do is respond to the needs, not just of that individual, though that's very important, but to the needs of that family system. And I think we can do that across levels. I think we can do that at the ballot box when we think about who we're electing, especially at the local level. And I think we can do that, as Janine said, from our spheres of influence, as we're thinking about the best ways to help.
Well, this has been an informative conversation and a sad one, but it is when we know more that we can do more. And I can't help but think about someone who, Jason Van Dyke, who served his time for Laquan McDonald, but who faced less prison time than many of the women that we've seen in this documentary. So we know there are things that we need to fix. And there's a lot of work to co-create a world that just doesn't see us as enemies or other, but can understand that we're humans with a shared experience, and we're all subject to the harm that our broken systems perpetrate on women and people who are incarcerated. And that's from the lack of resources for their children. It's from the health crises that they may bring with them when they return to communities. It's from all of those spaces. So I hope that this community conversation does what it was intended to do, provide you with a deeper perspective and a better understanding of what other humans are facing, so that you can make informed choices in all the spaces that are under fire for your vote, so that we can be awake and aware, kinder, and better able to take action for each of us. Watch the program on the 21st at 10 p.m. on all of our platforms. Thanks to Tim Russell and everyone at WTTW. This was brought to you by WTTW and Illinois Humanities, and it is an Independent Lens series documentary. Thank you so much to our last speaker, Reuben Jonathan Miller, Associate Professor at the University of Chicago, lots more to your name. Meredith Nnoka, the Illinois Humanities Envisioning Justice Fellow. Colette Payne, who shared her direct experience as the director of the Women's Justice Institute Reclamation Project and a returning citizen. And Janine Oddie, Associate Director, Workforce Development with Elevate. Look up their websites, follow them on social media, continue to help tell their stories. I'm Sylvia Ewing. Thank you for watching and good evening.